Lyndon Johnson was gambling his political career that American military power would convince Ho Chi Minh to abandon support for the Viet Cong. Instead, Ho prepared his people for the long fight. They may bring in 500,000 troops, 1 million, or even more. If the war lasts 10, 20 years or longer, the Vietnamese people will not be intimidated. Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. Through 1964, ground combat took place only in South Vietnam between Southern combatants, the American-backed South Vietnamese Army against the Communist-backed Viet Cong. But as American troops poured into Vietnam in 1965, Hanoi ordered troops of the North Vietnamese Army to begin infiltrating to the south. By late summer, they were massed in the Ia Drang Valley near Pleiku. The U.S. Army Sky Rangers, the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile, were sent to confront the enemy and block their advance. It was the first time large units were pitched into action by helicopter. The rival armies clashed at the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965. The firefight spanned 4 days and influenced the strategy for much of the war that followed. The combination of American air mobility and massive firepower killed more than 2,000 communist fighters, 10 times the number of Americans who fell. This favorable kill ratio convinced America's commanding general, William Westmoreland, that he could fight and win a war of attrition by grinding away at the enemy until he surrendered. Despite their losses, the North Vietnamese Army did not view Ia Drang as a defeat. From the experience, they adapted their strategy to avoid large-scale confrontations and build on the techniques of guerrilla warfare they had employed for centuries, engaging the enemy at close range by surprise when possible, and then fleeing before air and artillery support could be called in. As the United States went to war, officials maintained it was a battle for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. But General Westmoreland's war of attrition was pure muscle. For 3 years, the American war machine unleashed massive destruction on Vietnam. Operations with aggressive names like Search and Destroy targeted suspected enemy strongholds. Others were less discriminate. Vast areas of South Vietnam were turned into free fire zones, destroyed with chemical crop defoliants such as Agent Orange, or simply leveled. The campaigns inflicted enormous casualties on the enemy, but innocent South Vietnamese were caught in the crossfire and suffered horribly. They lived in constant fear of widespread bombing. Herbicides poisoned their children, livestock, and crops. They were forced from homes and watched as their villages were destroyed. One soldier expressed the futility of the American strategy. If they weren't pro-VC when we got here, they sure were when we left. U.S. officials used the growing body count as proof that it was winning the war. But the numbers told only part of the story. The enemy was able to withstand ghastly losses and rebuild to fight again. There was a seemingly endless number of willing recruits eager to join the fight. Many came from North Vietnam by way of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This web of supply routes snaked through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. The trail was the target of daily American bombing. But at night, women and children emerged to repair the damage. During the French War, it had been little more than a footpath. But by the mid-1960s, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a major artery for troops and supplies traveling south into the war zone. General Westmoreland was forced to ask the president for more and more reinforcements, just to keep pace with the enemy. By late 1967, there were nearly 500,000 American combat personnel in Vietnam. But Westmoreland's war of attrition, which had failed to grind down the communists, was exhausting his own troops and slowly wearing away at the patience of the American people. At President Johnson's urging, Westmoreland painted a different picture.
In 1968, a new phase is now starting. We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view.
The end of the war was, in fact, nowhere in sight. Even as Westmoreland spoke, the enemy was preparing for an epic offensive against the government and army of South Vietnam, designed to deal a knockout blow, regardless of the cost.